I want to talk about why I'm selling my Digitakt despite loving it. I know that sounds a bit contradictory, and I guess it is. It's a bit complicated. But before we dig in, let's address the elephant in the room. The correct pronunciation for this thing is Digitakt. It's a Swedish invention, it's a Swedish product made by a Swedish company, and it's a combination of two Swedish words, digital and takt. That becomes Digitakt. So anyone who says Digitakt, they're just making things more complicated. So please embrace your inner toddler and say it with me, Digitakt. With that out of the way, let's dig in. First of all, what is the Digitakt? To those familiar with the Syntakt, the Digitakt is the sampler sibling of the Syntakt. Another way of describing it would be to say that it's a sampler and a creative sequencer, but that's kind of underselling it quite a bit. The thing about Elektron gear is the Elektron workflow. That helps you quickly build muscle memory and get in the zone, where your focus is on making music. And of course, it has my absolute favorite Elektron feature, which is Control All. So even though I've talked about Control All several times before, it's difficult to really explain it without showing it. So I'll just do a very quick demo so you get a sense of what it is. Okay, so here's how the original song sounded like from the very beginning. This was sort of a 4 on the floor. The idea was to have a 4 on the floor type of song, but we quickly changed our mind and took it in a slightly different direction. So this is more close to the final jam we did. And then we changed the sounds. So it sounded more like this, almost like a wasp, the lead sound that is. So here, let me just quickly demo some things you could do with Control All. So I hold down the track button and then I can do all sorts of crazy things. Or not so crazy maybe. So that's the kind of stuff you can do with Control All. You can, well, maybe not that, but you can sort of morph things and you can change things on the fly and it can create some really interesting transitions, for example. And yeah, it's just very fun to use. So that's the thing. That's Control All. I highly recommend that you watch the Syntakt review that we published a bit earlier this year. It goes into more depth about Control All and gives more demos. But bottom line is, Control All is the most fun feature in any groovebox I've ever used. So the Digitakt has that too. Of course, the Syntakt has it. Arguably, the Syntakt version of it is even more fun. That's my opinion. Well, everything here is my opinion. But anyway, so that gives you an idea of Control All. I hope that was at least somewhat helpful. If you haven't subscribed, I would love for you to hit the subscribe button now. It's a perfect time to do it. You click it either with a mouse or with a finger, depending on what device you're on. And when you do, suddenly you will get a notification when we drop a new video. Sample browsing is one aspect that you just cannot escape when you're working with a sampler, and this is a sampler, whereas the Syntakt is a synthesizer, which means that you dial in synthesized sounds on the fly, and you don't have to necessarily look for presets unless you want to. There are synth presets, but you can very quickly deviate from a preset and you can make the sounds more evolving and more interesting. And that's what you do with synthesizers. Whereas on a sampler, well, I guess you can do it to some degree. You can open up a filter, you can do sort of the basic stuff like bit crush, or overdrive, but you can't really sort of change the anatomy of the sample. And so unless you, of course, go into sample browsing and change presets, which incidentally is what we did with Brinstar, the jam that I just played a preview of, where we sort of had different sounds for different parts of the song just to keep it more interesting. And just to be clear, I knew about all of these limitations before buying the Digitakt. The reality is that I mostly bought it because of gas. I really wanted the Digitakt 2, which is essentially the same as Digitakt 1, but on steroids, if you will. Like, it has double the amount of tracks, it has stereo tracks instead of mono tracks, it has more effects, it has chorus, it has more sort of synth-like features like portamento and things like that. So on paper, it's much more of a good fit for me as a synth person. But it's still fundamentally a sampler, whereas this is at the core a synthesizer. And to those of you who've heard the music that we make, First of all, thanks for listening to the music. It really means a lot to us. But you've also probably noticed that it's very synth heavy. I would say 80% of our music is synthesis, whereas maybe 20% is samples. We mostly use samples as part of sort of creating texture and ear candy and things like that for our songs. We don't use it so much for the lead sounds and things like that. I should mention that you can approach sort of pseudo synthesis on the Digitakt. It has things like single cycle waveforms that allows you to you can even scan a wavetable, so you can sort of do evolving sounds that way, but it's not quite the same, and it's not really the type of sounds that gets me going. I'm more into I would say, the virtual analog type of territory. That's sort of my let's say, sweet spot or more my proclivity, let's say. With all of this said, I would still say that the Digitakt is the most fun and productive pure sampler out there for electronic music producers. And a bit of a side note is that I often read people talking about whether they should get a Digitakt or a SP404. And to me, those are totally different beasts. The SP isn't really made for sequencer-based music at all. I mean, it has a sequencer technically, but it doesn't have any filter envelopes per sample. It doesn't. I mean, honestly, my opinion again, I can't really say that they have good workflow. I'd be interested if you think differently, and if Roland is your thing, tell me why in the comments below. One more side note is we bought the SP404. In fact, I traded a Digitakt for it, and so this is the third time I'm selling a Digitakt, is because I've done it before. I almost instantly regretted trading the Digitakt for the SP404. We used it for one production, and then we quickly sold it again. And I've said this in other videos before, but buy used gear. Then maybe you don't need to waste so much money while you're trying to explore what's right for you. But back to Digitakt. So people say that limitations breed creativity, and to a large degree I actually agree. But with that said, to me, the Digitakt is on the wrong side of being too limited. It has 8 monophonic tracks with mono samples, and it's just a bit tough to swallow if you're an 80% synth kind of musician. I like to reach something that starts to feel like a final production in the groovebox I'm using, meaning I'm very much a single box at a time kind of person, and I feel like the Digitakt needs a companion to really, really shine. And that companion could be the MC101, for example. It could be the Syntakt, it could be the Digitone, it could be some other form of device that leans more into synthesis. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I think that the Syntakt is also kind of limiting. But it's on the acceptable side of it, because there I have 12 tracks and there's synth tracks, so I can dial in sounds quickly with no preset browsing, and I can make the sounds evolve over time much more easily than I can on a Digitakt. The reason why that is a better compromise is that I have a preference for trying to reach something close to 80% of a fully produced song in the groovebox itself that I'm using. Meaning I'm happy with sort of filling in the blanks and doing some tweaks in the DAW if that's necessary to sort of take it to completion. I don't need the groovebox to do everything in one box, but I want it to get close enough to where I don't feel like I have to make a lot of compromises and sacrifices, and where I can start to get a really good feel for how the song will sound or will sort of end up sounding once it's in the DAW. So with the Digitakt, that's much more of a challenge for me than on the Syntakt. But one thing that is worth mentioning here, when we talk about the Elektron workflow, that also includes overbridge, meaning you can multi-track both the Digitakt and the Syntakt into the DAW with separated tracks, so you can do further mixing and adding effects and even adding more tracks. So depending on your proclivity, if you're more into samples or you're more into synthesis, both of these are fine instruments and perfect grooveboxes to start your music kind of sketching and noodling, and then you don't need to sort of waste anything. It's not like this is a sketch pad. You multi-track it into the DAW, and then you can continue and sort of finish the work. So both of them can do this. For me, because I'm 80% synth guy, I prefer to do that sort of sketching and noodling and jamming on a Syntakt, because then that means I only need to do 20% in the DAW instead of doing, I don't know, 80%. And that's a good segue to talk about alternatives to these devices, because there are boxes that do both sampling and synthesis in one single box. So, and that sort of gets into another kind of me thing, let's say, which is that I prefer to make music with one box at a time. I don't want to have multiple devices. I mean, this kind of video view gives the impression that I love to have multiple things connected, but I'm only keeping them here because I want to talk about them. The reality is I use one device at a time. I don't like to connect things with MIDI. That gives me a headache. For me, music making is something that happens in the kitchen, on the couch, in bed, and anywhere I am around the house at least. I don't normally take devices with me. I have this kind of mini tracker, which is kind of cool. And I've used that on vacations and I use it in other places. But normally I sort of make my music at home. So, but I don't often sit here in this studio and make music. This is the place where I most seldomly sit and make music. So you can imagine when you're sitting in bed and maybe your partner is sitting next to you watching Netflix or something like that, you don't want to have like a whole arrangement of devices in bed with cables and power cables and MIDI cables and audio cables. I mean, that's just a mess. So I prefer to use one box at a time. So that's again why the Syntakt is a better compromise for me, because then I can use that and I can get to 80% of a finished song and I can make it sound really good in my headphones. I have to be a little bit quiet because of the buttons. My wife doesn't like them very much. She prefers the MPC when I'm using that because it's much more quiet. So anyway, that's more of a detail, but that's also a consideration. You have to squeeze this hobby into your family life. And for me, at least, that means 2 kids, a wife, lots of obligations, full-time jobs. So I normally end up making music in bed. So I sort of press the buttons very gently on the Syntakt and the Digitakt, and normally that's fine. Okay, if you want a box that does both samples and synthesis, there are alternatives. And one of them is, of course, the Polygon Tracker Plus that I have right here. And you also have this mini version that has the same workflow as the Polygon Tracker Plus, has the same synth engines and the same sampler engine, but in a more neat, portable package. It's a very different workflow from Elektron though. It has its pros and cons. I really like this form factor actually, being able to take this with me. I had this with me on a couple of vacation trips and I made a couple of songs on it. We'll be posting those songs on the channel. If you're interested in our take on the Polyons, or if you want us to do maybe, I don't know, a review that compares the Polyons versus the Syntakt or something like that, leave a comment below. Then you also have the MC101 from Roland. We did one jam with the MC101 on the channel, but then honestly we sold it very shortly thereafter because I sort of have a thing against the Roland workflow in general. And I say that with great compassion and a big heart, because I started my music making journey on a Roland W30, which I still have here in my studio. But if I'm honest, the reason why I used it was because it was the only thing I had. So, and if the MC101 is the only thing you have, maybe you will like it too. I know Gabe Miller seems to love it, and but yeah, for me, it's just a bit too fiddly, too small, too limited, and just not very inspiring as far as workflow goes, as opposed to the Syntakt, which I think is fantastic, and as well as the Digitakt is 90% of the Syntakt amazingness. Now, if you want samples and synthesis in a Elektron box with overbridge, then, well, you're kind of out of luck, because there is no such box, at least not yet. There's this new speculation, rumor about this device called Tonverk, which, by the way, you heard it first here. That's the correct pronunciation of Tonverk. It's also a combination of 2 Swedish words. Well, it's technically also a word, but a very, very rare word. But yeah, Tonverk. So anyone who says Tonverk, I mean, you'll get a pass. It's okay. But if you say Tonverk, you will impress Swedish people more. But anyway, so that is supposedly, we don't know the details of this thing, of course, but it's supposedly combining samples and synthesis. And I think the problem with that is probably that it's going to be prohibitively expensive. So I'm skeptical, but only time will tell. And it might be the perfect groovebox, actually, if they do it right. Oh, and I would be crazy not to mention the MPC. It's a more of a, I would call that more of a production kind of environment than a proper groovebox, maybe, because it can do so much. But I mean, considering sort of price and form factor and everything, it is technically a groovebox. It's just a ridiculously competent groovebox. And so I think anyone in the market for grooveboxes that combines samples and synthesis would be crazy not to consider the MPC. Same with the Push 3 standalone, but that's even more sort of integrated into the Ableton environment. So, I mean, that's a pretty cool device. It's pretty expensive too. So, you know, we're sort of stretching maybe I didn't talk about budget, but none of these devices are necessarily cheap. But I would say the Push is at least twice as expensive as a Digitakt. Ricky Tines made this point recently, which I fully agree with, which is that you pay for the workflow. That is the thing about Elektron. And that's why I'm using it. That's why I'm so fast at going from 0 to a song sketch on the Syntakt. And the workflow for all of these other devices will be very different. So that's just an aspect to keep in mind. So let's wrap this up. I love the Digitakt. It has a very, very fun Elektron workflow. I made one of the songs that I'm the proudest of, which is kind of ironic because I am ultimately selling this thing. If I'm looking at how I'm using these devices, it's clear that I'm using the Digitakt the least, and that's why it has to go. So that doesn't mean that it's not a good sampler. In fact, it is the most fun sampler I've ever used. I would also say that the Digitakt really shines when you hook it up with something else. It's not really designed to be standalone. Arguably the Digitakt 2 is, but not the Digitakt 1. The Syntakt though, feels like it's more designed to be used in standalone, much like the Polyan. Again, if you disagree, I would love to hear it, and so please drop a comment. Part of why we're doing this YouTube channel is, I mean, A, we love to make music and we want to share it, but B, I enjoy being part of a community, and I just love the connection and engagement and the passion from like-minded people that also are interested in electronic music. So even if you disagree with me, you think this is the keeper and I should sell everything else, you know, I will enjoy that conversation. And we do respond to every comment. So keep that in mind. Don't just drop a comment and expect us to go silent on you. We will respond. But also, please keep in mind, gear is just gear. Ultimately, it's about what you make with these devices. So in the end, it's about making music. And I really hope that you're having fun when you're making music. So whichever device is right for you is the one, arguably, you're having the most fun with. It's that simple. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. I would really appreciate you. And we will be, as I said, posting a lot of other reviews, but 80% of our channel is definitely making music. So keep that in mind, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much.